This is the story of how a nation convinced itself, one order at a time, that some lives counted less than others, and where that conviction led. It begins not with gas chambers or camps, but with speeches, ledgers, and a country desperate enough to believe them. Everything that came after started here, in rooms very much like this one. Germany in the 1920s was a country brought to its knees. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped away territory, military power, and national pride, while war reparations and a currency collapse in 1923 wiped out the savings of an entire middle class overnight. Then came the Great Depression, and with it, 6 million unemployed. Into that anger stepped a movement that offered certainty, uniforms, marches, and an enemy. Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party built its power in beer halls and street brawls, its paramilitary brown shirts turning political rallies into battlegrounds, long before the party held real power in parliament. By 1932, aided by relentless propaganda and public disillusionment, with a fractured, ineffective government, the National Socialists had become the largest party in the German parliament, without ever winning an outright majority of the vote. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, not through revolution, but through backroom deals among conservative politicians who believed they could control him. Weeks later, a fire gutted the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building. The government blamed communists, suspended civil liberties, and within months, one law after another had dismantled German democracy from the inside. Power, once seized, moved through paperwork as much as through parades. In April 1933, the new government organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, painting stars and slogans across shop windows. Notices went up. Typewriters and rubber stamps did what soldiers had not yet been asked to do. They defined, one document at a time, who belonged and who did not. In May 1933, students and party loyalists burned tens of thousands of books in public squares across Germany, declaring entire libraries of thought by Jewish, socialist, and pacifist authors un-German and unfit to exist. 2 years later, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jewish citizens of their German citizenship altogether, banning marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and defining, by bloodline, exactly who the new laws applied to. Jewish doctors lost their patients, Jewish lawyers lost their license to practice. Passports were stamped with a red letter J, a mark that followed people across borders they were increasingly unable to cross freely. On the 9th of November 1938, a night later called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, coordinated mobs attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and Austria. Nearly 300 synagogues burned. Firefighters stood by under orders to protect only the buildings next door. By morning, 30,000 Jewish men had been arrested and sent to concentration camps, and glass covered the streets like snow. On the 1st of September 1939, German tanks crossed into Poland without a declaration of war, and Britain and France, bound by treaty, declared war on Germany 2 days later. Dive bombers struck ahead of the advance. Infantry followed on foot through open fields as the Luftwaffe reduced Polish airfields to rubble within hours. Warsaw was bombarded from the air for weeks as columns of refugees clogged roads, leading nowhere safe. Within a month, the Polish army was broken and its capital occupied, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union under a secret pact signed days before the invasion began. German officers marched their soldiers through captured squares in triumph. For Poland's 3 million Jews, the largest Jewish population in Europe, the occupation was only the beginning of what history would come to call the Holocaust. Beginning in 1939, German authorities in occupied Poland sealed Jewish populations inside walled districts, ghettos, cut off from food, medicine, and the outside world. In Warsaw alone, more than 400,000 people were crowded into an area a fraction the size of the city around it, an average of more than 9 people to a room. Behind those walls, life went on in whatever form it could. Ration cards allowed as little as 200 calories a day, punched at counters that never had enough to give. Communal kitchens tried to feed thousands with almost nothing, while typhus and starvation killed tens of thousands before a single train ever left for the camps. Children too small to be noticed by guards slipped through gaps in the walls to smuggle food back to their families, at constant risk of being shot on sight. Teachers ran secret schools in basements. Musicians performed in secret. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, a group of historians refused to let the record be erased. They buried testimony, photographs, ration cards, and diaries in sealed milk cans and tin boxes beneath the ghetto streets, a hidden archive meant to survive even if its authors did not. Parts of it were dug up years after the war had ended. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the largest land offensive in history, more than 3 million soldiers advancing along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Panzer columns stretched to the horizon across the Russian steppe, followed by infantry, artillery, and supply lines moving faster than any army before them, catching Soviet forces almost entirely by surprise. Behind the front lines, mobile killing units followed the advancing army into occupied towns and villages across Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Acting on direct orders from Berlin, they rounded up and shot Jewish civilians, Roma, and Soviet officials in mass executions, killings carried out in open country, at the edges of forests and ravines, often with the help of local collaborators, far from any battlefield. By the end of 1941, these units alone had murdered more than 1 million people before a single gas chamber had ever been built. These killings would later be recognized as the opening chapter of what historians call the Holocaust by bullets. On the 20th of January 1942, 15 senior Nazi and government officials gathered at a lakeside villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. In a meeting that lasted under 90 minutes, over cognac and coffee, they coordinated the machinery of a continent-wide murder already well underway, assigning each government ministry its role and giving the plan a name meant to obscure its true meaning, the final solution to the Jewish question. No vote was taken, no debate was recorded. The decision to murder Europe's Jews had already been made months earlier. This meeting simply settled the paperwork of who would carry it out and how. What followed required infrastructure as much as ideology. Deportations to the killing centers depended on the same railway system that moved German troops and freight, repurposed now to move people, entire communities loaded into freight wagons built for cargo, not passengers. Dozens of people crowded into a space meant for 8 horses, with no food, water, or sanitation for journeys that could last days. The trains ran on schedule, coordinated with the same bureaucratic precision as any other freight shipment, through rain and through the night, past crossings where no one waited, toward destinations most of those aboard could not have imagined. At the end of the line stood the camps, a sprawling system of transit points, forced labor sites, and extermination centers that stretched across occupied Europe, from France to the edge of the Soviet Union. At some, prisoners were registered, tattooed with a number, and put to work on starvation rations until they collapsed. At others, arrival itself was the end of the journey. By 1942, several of these sites had been fitted with gas chambers disguised as shower blocks, allowing killing to proceed at a scale the shooting squads in the East never could. What the camps left behind tells its own history. Mountains of eyeglasses sorted for reuse, warehouses of suitcases packed for journeys that never continued, index cards recording names that outlived the people who bore them. By the war's end, roughly 6 million Jews had been murdered, 2 out of every 3 Jews living in Europe before the war, along with millions of Roma, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, and other groups the regime had marked for destruction. Not everyone went quietly. By early 1943, most of the Warsaw Ghetto's original inhabitants had already been deported to their deaths, and those who remained understood what awaited them. In April, as German forces moved to liquidate what was left of the ghetto, a small, poorly armed resistance, organized months earlier in near-total secrecy, rose against them. Fighters barely out of their teens held tenement rooftops and cellar workshops with a handful of smuggled pistols, homemade grenades, and captured weapons, forcing German troops to fight building by building for a district they had expected to clear in 3 days. The uprising held out for nearly a month before it was crushed, and the ghetto burned to the ground, block by block, in reprisal. But for the first time in occupied Europe, an armed Jewish resistance had fought back against the machinery built to destroy it, and its story survived the fire that ended it. Liberation came from 2 directions at once, in the war's final winter and spring. January 1945, Soviet forces advancing through Poland reached Auschwitz and camps like it, days after most prisoners had been forced onto death marches west by fleeing guards. That spring, American and British troops liberated camps in Germany, encountering scenes that shocked even hardened soldiers who had fought across Europe for years. For the survivors, freedom did not undo what had happened. It simply meant they were still there to witness it and to tell it. In 1945 and 1946, the International Tribunal at Nuremberg put the surviving architects of this system on trial, using their own meticulous records as evidence against them. One of the first times in history the nation's leaders answered in open court for crimes committed in the name of the state. Survivor testimony, gathered by the thousands decades since, ensures the record does not depend on stone alone. The stones remember what the paperwork tried to erase.